Today we shall start chapter number 1, the modern history, which is called as a period of transition. Historians classify history into three broad periods: ancient, medieval, and modern. Each period is categorized on the basis of certain political, social, and economic characteristics specific to that period. Now, that historians are there, so they have classified history into three broad periods. First is ancient, another one is medieval, and third one is modern. And these periods are categorized on the basis of certain political, social, and economic characteristics specific to that period. Now, period of transition. Now, what actually is the period of transition? Transition means change. The propagation, the progression of time from one period to another in history is called transition or transitional period. These are perceived to be times of creative chaos or inactivity and decline. Now, what is given? That the progression of the time from one period to another in history is called transition or the transitional period. Okay, that the progression of time, progression means that is as we keep moving towards from one period to another, so that progression of time is called transition or transitional period. And these are perceived to be times of creative chaos, that is when we move from one period to another. So that is a law of nature, my dear children. That is when we move from one as the time passes, when we move from one state to the another state, from one condition to the better condition, so always that takes place, and that is perceived because of the creative chaos and inactivity and decline. So that is, there is decline of the previous period and there is emergence of the new period, and that we perceive. Either way, a study of transitions is important to understand why the previous period ended and how and why the new one emerged. Now, what is given? That either way, that is, if we see on the other side, that on one side, what we do, that we perceive the thing from one period to the another, and on the vice versa side, what is there? That when we move back to the old period, that is, if we try to analyze the old period, then what do we observe? That what was the reason for the decline of the previous period, why did it end, and how and why the new one emerged. So many things are there that comes to our mind, and we try to analyze it. Then after this, next paragraph: in every country, historical periods differ depending on several factors particular to the region. For example, the modern period in Europe started in the 15th century. However, in India, it started in the 18th century with the advent of the British. Now, what is given? That in every country, historical periods differ depending on several factors particular to the region. For example, the modern period in Europe started in 15th century, and in India also it started in the 18th century with the advent of the British. So that when Britishers came to India, then what was there? Then the modern era of India began. So same way in every country, historical periods differ depending on the several factors particular to that region. Now, next is sources of information. Historians reconstruct the modern age through various source materials which help in better understanding of this period. These materials are broadly classified into primary and secondary sources. So what are the sources of information, that how we come to know about those old periods or the new periods? So here historians reconstruct the modern age through various source materials which help in better understanding of this period. That is, the more we have contribution of the historians, that they only enable us to reconstruct about those sources. These materials are broadly classified into primary and secondary sources, and these materials which are there that we get by historians, whatever they collect, so that is classified into primary and secondary sources. So here you can see into this column primary sources and secondary sources. So what are the primary sources? First point is given, direct accounts from people living during that period in history. That is, during that history, the people who were living, so they only if give information, so that is called direct account. Okay, and then example is given there in the second point, that official records or diaries or travelogues, autobiographies, newspaper, poetry, novels, photographs, audiovisual materials, monuments, and archaeological art craft, and eyewitness accounts or oral narratives. That is, if any of these things are there, which gives us the relevant example or the relevant information, we can say, about the period, so that comes under primary sources. Okay, primary sources means that is the first hand sources which are available to us and which gives us the relevant information about the previous era or the previous period. Then secondary sources are given in the next one. First point, accounts of the period that are recorded by people who study the primary sources to interpret it and arrive at certain conclusions about the period. So what is given, that the accounts of the period that are recorded by people who study the primary sources to interpret it and arrive at certain conclusions about the period. Okay, and then example is given, that scholarly articles, research papers, and reports, reviews, books, audiovisual materials developed by contemporary scholars and researchers. That is, if any of these are there, that if any of the scholars are there, if they have prepared any articles or they have prepared their research paper or reports, they have prepared review books or audiovisual materials developed by contemporary scholars and researchers, so all these comes under secondary sources. Like here, as we are reading about the history, about its era, and we are trying to get information about the modern world, that how it advanced. So these information, how we are getting at present, children, at this moment we are getting it by reading this book only. Okay, so this book is a secondary source for us, because we have not any kind of direct link with the modern world or any of the person or any people who are living in that, who have lived in that area, isn't it? So that you should keep in mind, that what is this primary source and secondary source. Primary source means that is, if we have direct link of anything like official record or diaries or travelogues, autobiographies, newspaper, poetry, novel, photographs, so all those are direct. And secondary sources, that means indirect linkage if we have with any of the things. Next we have, turn the page. Next point is Europe and modern world. The modern period in Europe is said to have started in the late 15th century and spanned over 300 years. Okay, now what is there? That the modern period in Europe is said to have started in the late 15th century and it remained spanned means that is, it remained over 300 years. Modern age in Europe is associated with certain events like the decline of the medieval feudalism, the rise of towns and cities, increase in trade and commerce, and the rising consciousness of individual rights. Okay, what is given? That the modern age in Europe is associated with certain events. And what kind of events are these? Like the decline of the medieval feudalism, the rise of towns and cities, the increase in trade and commerce, and the rising consciousness of individual rights. So these events mark the transition of Europe from the Middle Age to the modern age. Okay, now you have to keep that in mind, children. That is Europe in the modern world. So the modern period of Europe is said to have started when? It was in late 15th century. and what are the different things, that is here the next point which is given, that what are the different points that is associated with the certain events of the modern age of Europe. It is the decline of the medieval feudalism, the rise of the towns and cities, the increase in trade and commerce, and the rising consciousness of the individual rights. Okay, that these were the things which were seen in the modern age in Europe. These events mark the transition of Europe from the Middle Age to the modern age. That is when Europe had its period from middle to modern age. So what were the changes, what were the transitions that were seen? So it was seen in the rise of the towns and cities. Once again I'm repeating, children, rise of the towns and cities, an increase in trade and commerce, and rising consciousness of the individual rights. Okay, then the Renaissance. From the 14th century till about the 16th, Europe saw a series of new developments in the field of arts, literature, science, and architecture, independent of the control of the church. So what is given about the Renaissance, that from the 14th century till about the 16th century, that is till the 2 centuries, Europe saw a series of new development. That is Europe, the people in the Europe saw a number of development, series of new development, means that is one after the other there were new developments in the field of art, literature, science and architecture, independent of the control of the church. That is, in these development there was no control of the church. This was a significant event since earlier the church kept the sphere of culture and knowledge under its constant scrutiny and control. So this was a significant event since earlier the church kept, that is before this what was there, that is from 15th to from the 14th century till about 16th century, whatever changes were there in the different field, so in that there was no control of the church. But before that, before 14th century, whatever changes were there or whatever things were used to take place, so church were used to control everything. So this period of great revival and regeneration in Europe is known as Renaissance. So this you have to keep in mind, that this period of great revival, that is after that is we can say with the emergence of the 14th century and till 16th century, when there was no control over anything of the churches. So this period of great revival and regeneration in Europe is known as Renaissance, and it is a French word that means rebirth. Okay, very important, children, that what is the meaning of Renaissance? It means rebirth, and it's a French word. Why this name is given to that period as Renaissance? Because there was complete change, that with the emergence of the 14th century and for 2 centuries, that is 14th 15th centuries, so what was there, that there was no control of the church on any of the things there in the Europe. Then next paragraph, the capture of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, by the Ottoman Turks in 1453 was a major development that fueled the spirit of Renaissance. Constantinople was the center of learning of the Roman Empire. It had numerous Greek scholars and intellects teaching Greco-Roman classics, evoking rational thinking. So what is given, that the capture of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine, that Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire by the Ottoman Turks, that is it was captured by Ottoman Turks in the year 1453, was the major development that it was the major development during that time that fueled the spirit of Renaissance. And Constantinople was the center of learning of the Roman Empire. That this place, this city was the center of the learning of the Roman Empire, and it had numerous Greek scholars. That Constantinople there, as it was the center of the Roman Empire, it was the center of learning. So there were number of Greek scholars and intellects teaching Greco-Roman classics. That what they were learning there, that they were taught Greco-Roman classics and evoking rational thinking, that they were evoking through their teachings about rational thinking. With the fall of Constantinople, many Greek scholars fled to different cities of Italy, like Florence, Milan, and Venice, carrying with them rare classical manuscripts. They were patronized by the wealthy merchants of Italy. Many libraries and universities were set up to promote classical and modern learning in Europe. So what is given, that with the with the fall of Constantinople, that when there was complete fall of this city Constantinople, many Greek scholars fled to different cities of Italy. That the scholars who were learning there, so they ran away, they fled away, they fled to different cities of Italy. And where, like, which were the different cities of Italy, like Florence, Milan, and Venice, carrying with them rare classical manuscripts. And what they carried with them as they fled to different cities, they fled with the classic manuscripts which were rarely found. Okay, and they were patronized by the wealthy merchants of Italy. Many libraries and universities were set up to promote classical and modern learning in Europe. And what was there, that many libraries and universities were set up in different cities of Europe, different places of Europe, to promote the classical and modern learning in Europe. Another important factor that helped spread the ideas of Renaissance throughout Europe was the development of printing in Europe. Okay, now the another important factor that helped spread the ideas of Renaissance throughout the Europe was development of printing in Europe. So printing also was the major factors that helped the spread of ideas of Renaissance throughout the Europe. In 1440, Johannes Gutenberg of Germany developed the movable printing press. So very important, you have to keep these kind of points in your mind, children. That is, in the year 1440, Johannes Gutenberg of Germany, he developed a moving printing press. By 1500, there were about 1,000 printers throughout Europe. Printed press enabled dissemination of racial ideas and opinions among a wider section of people. Popular books published included religious books like the Bible, as well as Latin and Greek classics, legal handbooks, and books on philosophy. The printing of books encouraged scholarly research, intellectual thinking, and there was an increase in public desire towards gaining knowledge. So what is given, that when Johannes Gutenberg of Germany, when he developed this movable printing press, so by the 1500 year, that by this year there were around many printing machines were there. And as the number of printing machines were increased, that as thousand printers were there in throughout of the Europe, so what was there, that more printing was there of the newspapers and magazines and the other things. And because of that, what was there, that the printing of books encouraged scholarly research and intellectual thinking. That was an increase in public desire towards gaining knowledge. That is, people started to show their interest in getting more and more and more knowledge. Okay, so that is what about the Renaissance. Okay, and characteristics of Renaissance. Now from here, dear children, we shall continue from the next class.